Environmental zone restriction ahead. Make sure you have the required permit to proceed.
What?
Environmental zone restriction ahead. Make sure you have the required permit to proceed.
I'm Mike.
And I'm Danny.
And this is Petrol Revolt.
RG500 story would be complete without Mark Dent. Mark is Performance Fabrications, and since the early 90s Mark has been modifying RG chassis, RG250 chassis to accept the 500 engine and tuning the 500 engine to power levels that no one else can get.
Hi guys.
Hi mate.
So road going RG came out in 86 to 88. There was a few straggling sales up to F plate on a 90, something like that. You've been tuning them since the early 90s, so you've been with RGs pretty much since year dot.
I have, yeah.
So how did you get into RGs?
One day down Box Hill with my mates, saw an RG going up and down the dual carriageway on its back wheel, and I thought, I want one of them. I was on the lookout for one. A friend went and found one in some guy's garage with the front end missing on it. Off with him 200 quid, haggled, got him down to £175, and I bought my RG for £175.
So have you always been more of a two-stroke lover?
Always been a two-stroke, yeah.
Because that era was just, the four-strokes were just starting to come in, wasn't they? So
They were. I've been two-strokes all my life. I've had four-stroke bikes, ZXRs, R60s, things like that, but nothing gives you that buzz.
No, just
of a
not.
high horsepower RG.
They're not quite the same, are they?
They're not.
So whilst they certainly give you a buzz, you obviously weren't content with the standard horsepower from an RG, so how did you get into making them into the awesome beasts that they are today?
I tinkered and made it terrifying. It's just the quest for more and more power and tuning. A long drawn out process, a lot of blown up engines, a lot of things broken, a lot of pistons on my shelves with holes in. The quest starts from a standard bike at 70 horsepower, then your goal is to get to 100 horsepower. But once you get to 100 horsepower, you then want to get 110 horsepower, and it just goes on and on. My RG ended up at 144.5 horsepower, which is basically a double on what Suzuki's got out the factory.
So back in those early days, did you do it just for personal achievement or fun? Did you think that you were going to commercially set up in business with RGs?
It was all for personal fun. There used to be a internet group which was done via mailing list back in those days, because boards and Facebook hadn't been existed, so it was just one email that we sent it to, Eric. All the people used to be on that, and we all used to talk, go through what we're doing, how we're doing with our bikes, and we all used to bounce things off of each other. I'm doing this, I'm doing that, I'm getting this horsepower, oh, but I've got this horsepower. And it was just a quest to get more and more and just be one up on everyone else. And that's where it led to.
And how easy was the first 20 horsepower to get to the last 20 horsepower you got out of one?
The first 20 horsepower is very, very easy.
Yeah.
The last 20 horsepower is very, very hard. It's a complete redesign of the engine and its ancillaries to get that last 20 horsepower. The first 20 horsepower, bit of porting, you're there. The RG is a very underpowered engine as it is as standard, so it's quite easy to actually extract power from it.
And we was talking earlier, like when you put a bike on the dyno, it can work fine, but when you put it on the track, it can work completely different. Although you always try and replicate as much as you can on the dyno,
Exactly.
it's always different. So was it try it on the dyno and then go and try it on the track, and it was a trial and error sort of thing?
Well, when I first started, I didn't really use dynos. I had a dyno 20 minutes down the road from me, which I used to do a lot of work on the engine. Used to take it to Ken Cooper. He used to put it on his dyno, do a couple of runs, see what it was, bring it back, and then go away. It wasn't to the advent of when I used to get my own dyno, which is then the gains really started happening, because you can try anything. And I've done some crazy stuff, which you wouldn't even think of trying, but I tried it. some of it worked, some of it didn't, and that's where the gains actually come.
So you've got the RG500 engine up to some pretty awesome power output. All these bikes here have got your motor, big bore kit, all the tuning work that you do, and at the back wheel, most of these will rattle out 115, 125. I think you've got some high hopes for that motor there.
Yeah, that motor behind you, that should be somewhere in the region of 140 to 145 horsepower. So that's a big jump on your 120 horsepower road bike on a bike which only weighs 130 kilos.
So you went from developing that horsepower to then not being content with the RG500 chassis, because you then developed a kit to put that 500 motor into the RGV250.
Yeah, we've put kits on RGV2. There's two kits that are common. It's the RGV250 and the Aprilia RS250, which are the two popular conversions which people are doing. And I've sold hundreds of kits throughout the world over the past 13, 14 years. It makes a very good bike because the chassis is a bit of a letdown on the RG. It is 80s technology. It does flex quite a lot, where the RGV or the RS is a lot stiffer, and it makes a really good bike.
What made you make that decision to try and, you know, make that adaptation into another chassis?
Snapping 3 frames.
Oh, really?
They used to pull the swinging arm spindles out.
Oh, flipping hell. Okay. Real trial and error.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What led you into that development on two-strokes? Where did that engineering knowledge come from?
A lot of reading up and a lot of trial and error. After 20 years playing with RG engines, I pretty much can tell you what everything will do and what everything won't do, depending on what you do to it. Same as jetting information. I know pretty much jetting information on what carbs, on any tune, exhaust, off the top of my head. I don't even need a dyno for it.
Without any sophisticated test and development kit, that's pretty phenomenal, because this two-stroke engine in the modern day wouldn't exist if it wasn't for a really gifted engineer called Walter Carden.
Exactly.
And he worked for MZ behind the Iron Curtain, and he was famous for using an oscilloscope to tune the pressure waves being returned back to the cylinder to extract more mixture throughout the whole engine process and develop phenomenal power.
Yeah.
You know, in the MZ days of the late 50s and 60s, they were kicking out about 200 brake horsepower per litre, where Suzuki were down at 110, 120 brake horsepower per litre. And Suzuki were nowhere really. I think they were pretty embarrassed in the late 50s, early 60s TT racing. And they obviously saw something in what MZ were doing because they wanted a piece of it. That led to Suzuki having eyes on Ernst Degner, which was MZ's factory rider, and Degner defected to Suzuki and took all the secrets from MZ with him, and then a year or so later Suzuki were up at 200, 220 brake horsepower per litre.
Exactly.
And I don't think it was, Degner never had the information written down, and it, you know, it's going back to the old days where the riders had a lot to do with the development of the bike, with their feedback and stuff like that. And obviously Degner working close with MZ, well, he was their #1 rider, and so he was obviously clever enough and had stored all that information in his brain. He didn't need it written down on paper to let Suzuki know. So he was also a clever guy and a clever engineer, with being a very good rider as well. How did it come about that Degner left MZ? Because it must have been a real difficult time, and it must have been a difficult decision for him to make, because obviously MZ treated him almost like a son.
Degner and his wife didn't want to bring their kids up under a totalitarian regime. They didn't like the oppressiveness of the communist state behind the Iron Curtain. And also Degner was seeing the rest of the Western riders enjoy a lavish lifestyle, whilst he was chaperoned by the Stasi back to his hotel room to have bread and water. So Degner wanted a bit of the high life and wanted a better upbringing for his kids. So Suzuki and Degner hatched a plan for Degner and his family to defect, and it was at the Belgian Grand Prix one year where, as the story goes, Degner seized his motorbike up, went back to the paddock, Or the hotel room, it's difficult to get the exact story, and then a car was provided by Suzuki and Degner slipped out of the control of the Stasi. So obviously Degner was a pretty phenomenal engineer as well as a rider, and with his efforts in 61-62 he took Suzuki to a bhp per litre that Suzuki were nowhere near close before that. And then we've got to fast forward all the way to 1974 before Suzuki came up with the 500cc two-stroke.
And if you look at it, 1974 was the first year they had it. 75 was the first in Assen, was Barry's first Grand Prix win on it. And then 76, he won the World Championship. So again, you know, Barry was a bit of a playboy, party animal is what people like to see on the outside, but he must have put a lot of work into developing that bike to, you know, bringing it in 74 to having a major accident as well at Daytona at the beginning of 75. For them to be world champion in 76, they'd done a hell of a lot of work on that motorcycle then, and then not forgetting after that the amount of RG500s on the grid, what they were selling to privateer people, you know, and it was just, it was an incredible thing, you know, and it all happened in such a short space of time because Suzuki done a fantastic job. They put a fantastic customer package out there where Barry might not have been too happy about it, but you know, that's the way to sell motorbikes, is to give people a bike what they can pretty much isn't so far away from what Barry had. And it's not like nowadays. Back then you could buy the bike, the RG500 race package of Suzuki, and do your own experiments, like what you've done, I suppose.
Exactly,
you know,
yeah.
They could do their own experiments on it. So they could go home and tinker with it and find little things, whereas Suzuki would be doing the same, but you had no computers back in them days, so you could try something, and if someone else, a privateer, found something, you know, they didn't have to tell anyone about it. And there was a lot of names, Will Hartog and all them sort of guys running at the front and winning races and battling with Barry on a customer RG, and that's where Suzuki shone, wasn't it?
That's right. You know, Suzuki were often famed for wanting the constructors' title, and they weren't too bothered about the riders' title. If a rider wins the title, it's the riders' championship. But if Suzuki win the constructors' championship, then Suzuki are the GP 500 constructors' champion.
Yeah, you know, it's you can look at it two different ways, can't you? Rightly or wrongly, Barry would have wanted to be world champion more times, but then on Suzuki's side of things, they want to sell motorbikes. But without Barry, without his input, would have they been able to get there? And before that as well, you know, with Degner's input and stuff like that, it's a big story. And without Degner, then Suzuki probably wouldn't even be where they are today. So, as I'm not the most technical person, because I'm a modern day motorcycle racer, unfortunately I'm not like Barry and can't go into technical details, we'll bring Mark over and Mark can talk us through some of the technical stuff on the bike.
Well, as we've both been discussing earlier, I suppose the most apparent thing about this bike is actually how basic and crude in construction it is compared to a modern day race bike. Modern day race bikes, everything's fully 3D machined and everything serves an absolute specific task in minimal weight and enabling the rider to go as fast as he can. Where this, as you can probably see, looks like someone's actually made the frame in a shed.
Yeah.
With their MIG welder.
Well, I suppose in a way it was made in.
It was made in a shed.
Not in a shed, but you know,
Yeah.
in a workshop, and it was a guy who was welding it himself and
Exactly.
and doing all that.
Yeah, there's
sort
no
of stuff
fancy
himself.
state-of-the-art factories back then as what there used to be nowadays. Things seriously have changed. If we start from the rear of the bike, I suppose the most apparent thing on this, compared to modern day bikes, we're running twin shocks on the swinging arm. And even more interesting is the lack of adjustment on it.
Yeah.
He's got, what, 6 clicks on his preload, and that's it. How would you feel about that on one of your bikes?
I think I'll come in moaning a lot, to be honest, and they'll probably tell me to get back out there and
But at
just
least it
ride
doesn't give
around
you
it.
many options to get it right or wrong.
No, it doesn't. But again, it makes the riders back in them day. That's how special they were, because if they had a problem, 9 times out of 10, they had to ride around the problem, because, like you say, there's not much adjustment on it.
Exactly, as you're aware, a lot of time is made up on chassis geometry and setting the chassis up to get round corners on braking, etc. But when there's very, very little adjustment, there's not a lot the rider can do, barring pray to God.
And I suppose also that's why Suzuki and the manufacturers were so focused on the engine, because that's where they could make the advantage rather than making it up through the chassis. Whereas now, a lot of development goes into the chassis and suspension side of things, doesn't it?
Well, chassis tuning's an art in itself on how a chassis flexes, where one of these things, you wouldn't have a clue how it flexes. Well, I should imagine it will flex everywhere compared to a modern day chassis. Weight saving on the rear. Again, rear brake assembly, pretty non-existent. Big cast iron disc and a massive caliper underneath, which in contrast to today's bikes, very small calipers and discs, again, minimise the weight and unsprung weight. Right, the engine on this bike is magnesium cases. The carburetors are also magnesium. It's a square 4 setup, 54 bore, 54 stroke, and this was a very, very successful engine. Cassette gearbox, very compact, very light, and did produce really good power.
I mean, I don't know if it's true or not, because, like I said, I'm not very technical, but I know Suzuki had a stepped engine at one point, didn't they? I think after this.
They did,
and
yes.
They could move the engine around in the chassis, but again, coming down to the geometry of the chassis and that, this engine is fixed in the chassis.
This engine on the 14, it is in a fixed position. They can't move it anywhere. So again, there's no adjustments to chassis weight loading via the motor. It is where it is, and you ride around it.
Yeah, yeah.
And attached to the engine is the exhausts. Again, quite an old type of design for an exhaust, which is quite surprising. Well, it's not surprising today because exhaust technology hadn't actually evolved to what it has nowadays. Very small expansion chambers, primaries, doesn't get the best out of the engine, makes a very narrow power band, and all the silencers are also integrated into the pipes as well.
But
very short.
It's how small the pipe.
Yeah, the pipe outlet's very small. I imagine it's a very small stinger diameter, a lot smaller than what we run nowadays. I would have thought that detonation might have been a problem on that, and it would get quite hot in there.
So what do you reckon the RPM range would have been roughly on this sort of bike? Because I mean, we all know these were very, very difficult bikes to ride.
They were. I imagine he would have had a 3,000 RPM
yeah.
power band in this thing, which he always had to be within.
Yeah, I mean, when I rode the RG around the Isle of Man, it was from 8.5, 9 really to 11.5. So it was always that
exactly
short.
It's not like a 4-stroke where you've got the torque to pull you out. As soon as you come out of that power band, as you start slipping clutches coming out of corners, they're hard to ride.
Well, you had to ride them right, didn't you? And you had to, if you didn't, you would lose a matter of seconds in a corner rather than tenths.
That's right. Right, the front, again, quite a weird setup. The calipers are at the front of the forks.
We noticed this when it first came in.
We did.
We couldn't understand why they've got the calipers in front of the forks.
One of the theories we came up with was possibly cooling. If it's behind the fork bottom, it doesn't get as much air. There's actually no adjustment on the forks, again. So there's no compression, no rebound, nothing. So what you got is what you've got. I suppose the only thing you can change is oil and air gap and springs. But a lot of those things you obviously can't do on the fly.
Well, no, exactly. It's not like nowadays, you know, you just got a tool to wind it off.
Exactly.
Stick a spring in sort of thing. I bet it'd be a lot more complicated. And also, nowadays, the forks are also the other way round, aren't they?
Yeah,
so
these are right way up forks.
the correct way, the real way.
Yeah, the original way.
And also in this, we had the dry clutch, didn't we?
Yes, we did.
I'm a personal fan of having a dry clutch because I think it just sounds absolutely awesome.
It does sound awesome, and obviously there's less drag on the engine because it's not running through the gearbox, through the oil, and they don't get as hot. But on the flip side, they obviously don't last as long as a wet clutch. Plates have to be changed very frequently. I'd imagine the plates on this thing, after every single race, they were taken out, thrown away, and a new set put in. Again, very sparse in the cockpit. Nowadays, we have multitudes of gauges and clocks telling us exactly what's happening. This is very sparse. All you've got is revs and engine temperature, and that's it. Nothing else.
I mean, the way the screen is and stuff like that, it's just...
Well, as you found when you sat on it, everything seems to be in the way.
Well, normally your head, nowadays your head would be down here, but you wouldn't be able to do that because obviously the screen's in the way. The screen obviously that's done for aerodynamic.
But then also riding styles have changed a lot since the 70s as well. I mean, Barry didn't really wear knee sliders either.
No, they have changed a lot.
Which is obviously, I don't think he was moving about on the seat like what you do nowadays.
No, which is actually, when you sit on this, it's quite nice because you do feel part of the, I mean, my size, I feel part of the bike. But to actually move around like you would nowadays, you wouldn't be able to do that on this sort of bike. The rad is, I mean, it's quite a small rad, isn't it?
It's actually a very small rad. It almost looks like it's off of a road bike.
Yeah.
It almost looks like it's off a Yamaha ALC 350, but I'm sure it's not.
Because obviously in the hot countries, you know, you need it to cool, don't you?
You do,
I
but
know,
then
like,
again, if you think about it, this bike was only making 114 horsepower.
Yeah, yeah.
It's not got a lot to cool, really. And the cylinders on these things have very large water jackets. It's got 4 individual barrels on this, all with their own water supplies going coolant straight to them. So it's a very efficient cooling system.
You say that the major differences compared to, obviously, is this 10 years on from?
This is 10 years on. This is a 1985, which is when the RG500 first hit the streets. And again, it was derived from the RG500 race bike. If you look at an XR45 next to this bike, they look pretty much identical. It was always sold as the GP bike for the street, just like Barry used to race.
Yeah, yeah.
To be honest, I'd imagine the chassis on this was actually better than the race bike. You do have a little bit more adjustability, got a monoshock, which has rebound and compression. Still a square 4 engine, carbs outboard, rotary valves. But they changed the bore and stroke to the race bike. Like I say, the race bike was 54. This is a 56 bore and 50.6 stroke.
Right.
Cassette gearbox, same as the race bike.
Yeah.
This runs 2 crankshafts, one in the front pair of cylinders and one in the rear pair of cylinders. That has 4 separate crankshafts, and this is tied together by a pilot shaft. Forks on these, again, have more adjustment than what they do on the race bike.
Yeah.
These came with anti-dive, with adjustment on them. The anti-dive never really worked that great on it. Most people do blank them off nowadays and put different internals in them. But this is an extruded chassis on this, which is very, very light. Exhausts, this has obviously got a set of aftermarket exhausts, which I've made. Big power gains nowadays from exhausts.
I mean, you notice, that's the thing, you notice the difference on this compared to that. I know it's quite, you know, this is quite 10 years newer, but it's a road bike. But like you say, the exhaust you've made for it look a lot different to, obviously, these exhausts.
Yeah, exhaust technology has come on a long way in the past 20, 30 years. We understand how they work a bit more. The RG runs a unique power valve system. It's not actually a power valve system.
Right, yeah.
It's an exhaust valve. And what it does is it opens a chamber up into the cylinder head to increase the exhaust volume. And what that does is it helps bottom end torque and power. It's different to what Yamahas run. They have a power valve system where it actually changes the height of the exhaust port by a rotary valve. Suzuki's couldn't do that. Yamaha's patented it, so this was Suzuki's answer to it they changed the exhaust volume instead of changing the actual port height.
Right, okay. Okay, I mean, it's unbelievable, really, isn't it, that obviously Suzuki, that was their aim, to be able to sell a road bike like what Barry Sheen rode. But if you think about it now, in the modern era, I know we got Honda with the RCV, and you had Ducati with the Desmodici, yeah. But it's, I mean, this is it was an affordable road bike to go and buy to go and ride on the road.
It was, and now you think how many of these actually ended up on the track when they were released. So many club races used to race RG500s, and they were the road RG500s.
Yeah.
They were very competitive on track. There were hundreds of races around the UK every single weekend of every month of the year. So they was as good on the track as what they were on the road.
And I'm not being funny, even now, you look at it and it still looks like an awesome piece of kit. And I've rode a few RGs and that for Team Classic Suzuki and stuff like that. But even riding them bikes, it's just an incredible feeling you get from it. And the power they actually got from it from that era is mind-blowing.
Oh, it's amazing. I mean, these things Suzuki stated were 92 out the crate. That's crank horsepower, it's not rear wheel horsepower. At the rear wheel, they're around about 72 horsepower. But as you went, I mean, you can tune these things up to 140 horsepower nowadays.
Yeah.
But because they are so light and so nimble, it's a good buzz.
Yeah.
There's pretty much nothing that compares to them. It's an experience that, unless you've actually ridden one, you can't actually say you've accomplished your motorcycling dreams until you've ridden or raced one.
No.
Because they are totally different to anything else.
Yeah. Well, that's like I've ticked a lot of boxes in my career, but one of the biggest boxes was to ride a bike like Barry and to be able to do that around somewhere
Exactly,
like the Isle of
yeah.
Man, and that it was just a massive career highlight. And just to see, obviously I'm learning a lot now about the RG era and stuff like that, and it's amazing to think what Suzuki done back in them days.
It was, I wouldn't say it was a brave choice, but it was a quite obvious choice because of the popularity of the RG500s and the following, that Barry gave it.
Yeah.
They were onto a winner to start with. But then the big 4 strokes came out and it kind of killed the 2 strokes. The RG500 was sold on the road for, only 5 years. That's all it was done. And then it was gone, the big 4 strokes took over.
And also I've noticed that obviously we're here looking at the RG500 and it's in Pepsi colours. Now I know that they run the Pepsi bike, they didn't run it on an RG, they ran it on the RGV, didn't they? So
They did, the RGV500.
Do you know why they decided to put it in Pepsi colours?
Obviously Schwantz was on the RGV500. Everybody loved Schwantz, he was a fantastic rider. The RGV was winning everything. In '89, Suzuki still had stocks of the RG500 in shops. The GSX-R 750 came out, nobody wanted an RG500. So what's the next best thing to do? We'll make them slightly different, something popular, we'll try and get them off the shops. So Suzuki's commissioned Dream Machine Paint to paint 50, we're led to believe, Pepsis and 50 Skull Bandits to make them more appealing to the general public as special one-off bikes.
So this bike is a very rare motorcycle.
It is one of 50. And a little nugget of information, apparently Pepsi gave Michael Jackson one.
Oh, really?
He used to do the Pepsi adverts, and there are pictures with Michael Jackson with his RG500, which nobody actually knows where it is now.
Bloody hell, I didn't know that. Well, I reckon the next thing for me to do is to try and blag myself a bit of a ride on this, because
Definitely, mate.
It looks like an awesome bit of kit.
So we've got a 570 motor in this Pepsi, which has got pretty much every tuning trick you can throw at it. We reckon that on the dyno at the rear wheel, it's about 120 horsepower. It probably weighs in at something like 145 kilogram. It's going to be really interesting to get Danny's thoughts on how this performs compared to the Suzuki race bikes that he's ridden around circuit, especially the Team Classic Suzuki bike around the TT. All right, should we get her warmed up then, Danny?
I think so, eh? I better get myself warmed up. Yeah, we'll get it warmed up and go and spin a couple of laps, eh? You can just hear the power band. It just wants to come in. It can snap out really easy on you. Oh, I'll tell you what a beautiful bike though. Beautiful, absolutely. I'm not, even though this is just a road going one, I'll tell you what, I thought it was going to handle worse than what it does. So the main differences are from my race RG to this. This you feel like you sit a little bit lower in the seat, You've got a little bit more leg room to move around the bike. You've got a lot more on this compared to the race bike. Love it. Just that sound of the two-stroke. The way the throttle connection's really nice. Of course you've got a power band because it's a two-stroke, so you've got to be careful. But yeah, I would say it's a bit more easier to ride. The spread of power is more on this, whereas the race one you had to have it between 9 and 11,000 RPM, otherwise it didn't go anywhere. But this is a lot more rideable. But there's not, to be honest, there's not the actual engine, the engine power of it is very similar to the one I raced in the Isle of Man just a couple of years ago. So really surprising. Really surprising, but it's I'm surprised with how good the engine is on this. Again, the chassis is not great compared to the race one, but it is. Oh, I'm getting a bit more comfortable with it. Oh, I'll tell you what a beautiful bike though. Beautiful, absolutely. What a bike though, amazing. I'm really impressed with it, especially the engine on it. That's awesome, that is. It's mega just to be back on a two-stroke again. But no, it's mega. It's to be honest, the engine compared to the race engines, there's not a lot of difference in it. Of course the chassis is a bit different, but like, yeah, the actual riding position is more comfortable because obviously you're sitting up a bit more, you got a bit more leg room and stuff like that. But the chassis is not as good and it doesn't handle as good, but it doesn't handle bad. You know, for a road bike, it really don't handle bad. So I've ridden worse anyway. But the engine on it is just it's phenomenal. It's like even from 7,000, that's when it comes in, and on the race bike it doesn't come in till 9, so it's easier to ride and it's got the power as well. So it doesn't rev as high, but it's still got the power. Awesome, loved it.
Well, you can't have all that fun to yourself. I think I'm going to grab a Skull Bandit and I think I'm going to come and join you.
I think you should, mate. I mean, who doesn't love a two-stroke? Flicking it down the gearbox, and I'll tell you what, I know the modern day bikes are very good bikes, but old two-stroke 500, no traction control, she's got a power band on her. What do you reckon about them, Danny? Oh, I'll tell you what. Well, just riding the 500 two-stroke's awesome, but it's different to the Pepsi bike, definitely. But power-wise, I think they're the same. They're just an awesome bit of kit, aren't they? They're a real man's bike. Like the power band you've got on them are quite short, but these are a lot easier to ride than the race bikes, definitely. I mean, like my classic bike felt a lot more you sat on top of the classic bike a lot more. And like from the foot pegs to the seat, so the foot pegs were higher up, but the whole bike was almost higher up, but you had less room in between the seat and the footrest and the foot peg, so you was a lot more cramped. So it's a lot more comfortable on these bikes to ride because of that, and you sit more in the bike, whereas on the race bike you sit more on top of it and you're more over the top of it. Actually on my race bike we had to put more foam to give me more leg room. So I mean, like Rob Mack rode this, you know, he rode the Skull Bandit bike, didn't he? And he was a big lad. I don't know how he got on it. Because I'm a little lad, I don't know how he got on it and how he got his legs bent, and he done, I don't know what a senior TT was then back then, 4 laps maybe, 5 laps. And he'd done a full 5 laps like that, being as big as he was. I don't know how he done it. And he's still got a lap record around there, which we tried to go and break, but we didn't succeed, unfortunately.
Yeah, these RGs can be pretty temperamental. They've behaved themselves here today, but any RG owner will tell you that you start it up one day, you'll cold foul the plug, you won't ever get it firing on one cylinder. All manner of things that are just silly really go wrong with these bikes. But when they're working like these two have done, and they don't cause you any problem, you can have some real fun on them.
They don't. It's like anything. Like back in when I was doing 125 GPs, you know, you could, the night before, you could warm the bike up, and you could come the next morning, nothing's changed, and the bike wouldn't start. It's just, I think that's just the nature of two-strokes, isn't it? But for me personally, that's why I love two-strokes. I just love two-strokes. I love the sound, the smell, the way you have to ride them. Not, you know, for me that's my passion, you know, old bikes and two-strokes. Just yeah, it's a beautiful thing, isn't it?
To find out more about Petrol Revolt, then please head across to our website, petrolrevolt.com.